Hi, everyone. I'm Hanovi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator for Redwind Consulting, and I will be the host for this webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you are interested, you can contact me at hanovi@red-wind.net. Presenting with us today are Hope Wenke and Victoria Ybanez. Hope is an enrolled member of the Omaha Tribe of Nebraska. She has worked with Redwind as an advocate and currently serves as program director. She previously worked as a program director of the SEA Advocate Program. She is currently the project coordinator of the RUN-TTA project. She has been working to address violence against Native survivors of domestic and sexual violence through direct services, and she has worked as a confidential advocate in the Colorado statutory requirements for this capacity. Prior to working with Redwind, she worked for Rock Solid Chiropractic as the marketing representative, presenting the public image of the company's office and services. She has experience including working with the Omaha Tribal Social Services as an office manager, and that included overseeing general office operations, coordinating appointments, and my apologies, and overseeing social media campaigns and events. And as for our other presenter, she is Victoria Ybanez. She is the executive director of Redwind Consulting. She is Navajo, Apache, and Mexican, and she has been working to end violence against Native Americans and Alaskan Natives women for over 30 years. She developed and has been working with Redwind for 15 years now, and she's been coordinating and providing tribal technical assistance for recipients of the Tribal Governments Program for the United States Department of Justice on the Office of Violence Against Women. Current projects include the development and implementation of tribal-specific shelter and addressing the elder abuse. She developed Redwind's National Tribal Advocate Center, which has been providing 40-hour domestic violence training institutes and 40-hour sexual assault training institutes, and she developed the curriculum for each training and serves as lead faculty. If anyone has any questions before we start, you can put them into the chat box, or you can raise your hand and we will be able to see that. And if you have any questions, you can put them there. And I will now turn it over to our presenters.
Thanks, Hanovi. First, I just wanted to welcome everybody and thank you for joining our webinar today. I hope everybody's staying safe with the pandemic. As Novi mentioned, we'll be taking a few breaks, so if you have any questions, you can add those in the chat box or raise your hand. We will take a few breaks in between slides, and then also we'll have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. So like Novi had mentioned before, I have actually been with Redwind for a few years now, working as an advocate in the SEA Advocate Program. And I had this amazing opportunity to work on this project with Vicki. So right now I'm gonna turn it over to Vicki, have her do her introduction and a little history about Redwind, and then we'll come back and talk about the new project.
Hi, everybody. So again, I would also like to welcome you as well. As Hanovi mentioned, I'm the executive director at Redwind, and Redwind was formed in 2005 to provide additional resources and support to tribes developing responses to Native victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, and dating violence, and more recently, sex trafficking. And through our work, we started out initially working with a focus around addressing or supporting programs in emergency shelter, transitional housing. And then that has since grown. So Redwin actually has 4 OVW tribal technical assistance projects through the Tribal Affairs Division. And the first one is what we call Housing and Homeless Services, which is the transitional housing emergency shelter, as well as working with our tribal housing authorities. Another one is Children and Youth Services, which includes developing responses within the school systems to address the impacts of domestic violence on children and youth, as well as addressing dating violence. And we have our Tribal College Campus program that is a unique project in that it allows us to work with all of the tribal colleges. That includes those that are not currently grantees of OVW. So we get to work with all 37 campuses, and the focus is in developing a holistic response to sexual assault. And I will let Hope talk about the urban project.
So the Responses to Urban Native program is Redwin's newest project, and it'll provide technical assistance to programs working with Native victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence. Redwin will bring together Native specific resources to urban Native programs, facilitate a means for programs to incorporate values and belief systems within their own programs, develop peer relationships with other programs, and then help build the capacity of the urban Native program to coordinate and access services with non-Native partners. Examples of the technical assistance that Redwin can provide is helping with planning for the delivery of culturally specific services, strategies for incorporating cultural activities, conducting outreach and community education, also building relationships with and coordination of services with system practitioners, review policies and protocols, and then problem solving. Also, our target audience for the Responses to Urban Native program is OVW grantees, potential grantees, and that includes urban Native programs and non-Native programs. So according to the US Census data, there's about 5.2 million American Indian and Alaska Natives. Native people residing in urban areas are amongst the most invisible populations in the nation. And we know that around 78% of American Indian and Alaska Natives live off reservation. So we're going to take a look at a few maps. If you could change the slide, Novi. Oh, first we're actually going to talk about stats, sorry. So what we do know, and this is according to the National Institute of Justice study back in 2016, we do know that, again, 78% of the population live near cities. More than 4 in 5, that's about 84% of Native women have experienced lifetime violence in their lifetime. More than half of Native women have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And another half of Native women have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. We know that 96%, the vast majority of Native female victims of sexual violence have experienced that violence at the hands of a non-Native perpetrator. Also, Native women face murder rates at a rate 10 times more than the national average in some counties. And then also Native victims of violence are less likely to receive needed services. So we can see the crucial need there. And Novi, can you switch the slide, please? All right, so this map is showing us that by state-wise, the population, the Native population. So Native American, Alaska Native people have been impacted by historical and intergenerational trauma. This impact includes loss of land, their culture, their language, Native identity. And so it's really important for us to note that this data isn't specific to urban areas, but that we often don't have the data for our community in the urban areas. But this map here, and the teal is showing us the highest Native population. Next slide, Novi. We do know as a result of the policies in the 1950s was a reason why large populations of natives moved to the urban areas. The relocation separated many Native people from their homelands and in turn has impaired the need for their connectedness for a balanced life. So the second map is actually more specific to urban areas in each state. On this map, you can see that Phoenix, New York, Los Angeles, and Tulsa are amongst the top native populated cities. And then national training and technical assistance becomes so important in these spaces because it creates, builds, and enhances appropriate cultural responses to urban natives that are underserved. And does anybody have any questions at this point or comments?
Well, I would just add that, so when we look at this map, we can see that it's from 2015. And what we do know is that these populations are even higher than what they're showing in the map. So for you, if you're looking at your own population, you could probably expect the number to be higher. So for example, for us located in Colorado, that when we look at the Denver area, it says 50,348. And the reality that we know is that here on the Front Range, we have about 83,000 urban natives, with probably around 70,000, give or take a few thousand in the Denver metro area, just as an example.
Thanks, Vicki. And Novi, if you could go to the next slide. So the purpose of this project is really to improve responses for the American Indian and Alaska Native populations that reside in urban locations. Again, we provide the training and technical assistance to improve victim services and justice responses with a focus on addressing those unique challenges faced by Native victims. Next slide. So Redwind is currently working on developing a toolkit that includes a resource packet, bibliography, fact sheets, and these are tools that are Native specific and can be used by programs to help with building community partnerships to enhance that program capacity, help with foundations of advocacy, and also foundations for trauma work that's culturally specific. We currently have developed a program brochure, urban Native population fact sheet, and a unique legal challenge fact sheet. That's they're all on our website electronically. That's on Redwind's website under the Responses to Urban Native Programs webpage. And as we continue to develop, we plan to continue to create and distribute more materials in the near future. Next slide.
So one of the other areas that we work in through this Urban Native technical training and technical assistance is we can provide webinars, and such as what we're doing right now. But when we think about it, when I think about webinars and what we can make available, we have a few main areas that we'll focus on, but we want to be able to provide ongoing webinars on an annual basis. So not necessarily every month, but we'll have short series that'll carry through a portion of the year every year, so that we'll start to be developing an archive of resources for programs to be able to reach back and look for topics that might be helpful for them in their work. And all the archives will show up on our website. And so as anybody's looking for webinars, they can check our website. On our website, we have a section, a tab at the top that says calendar of events. And so any currently planned webinars would be on there. Next slide. And so right now, through the work that's been being done for this current webinar series, these are some of the topics that we're focused on in terms of looking at culture within a local response, safety for victims, confidentiality, responses for our Two-Spirit LGBTQ relatives, unique legal issues for urban victims, and then we're also planning a panel discussion focused on building relationships with our non-Native partners. And through our work with our national TA, with the way we developed the project, we included partners in there. So some of our partners on this project are actually operating urban Native programs or working out of urban centers in already providing responses to our Native populations. And so when I think about that panel discussion, we'll have our partners from our project that will be involved in talking about building the relationships with our non-Native partners. The other thing that I want to say is that we always are looking for ideas of things that would be helpful about what kind of topics to provide through our webinar series. And as we're talking with people in the course of our work or get feedback in different kinds of ways, we kind of put that in a place where we go back and revisit it when we're getting ready to plan a webinar series so that we can see what people are even asking for in terms of specific topics. Next slide, please. We also provide a range of different kind of training. And so the first option here is conducting on-site training and technical assistance. And so in the grant, we can provide 6 to 8 site visits. And currently under the time of this pandemic that's going on, our site visits are virtual. So that when we talk about an on-site technical assistance for different locations, we're talking about an intensive period of work with a site. So if we were to go and visit on-site locally, then generally that would be a day to 2 days. Sometimes it goes a little bit longer, up to 3 days. So when we think about it virtually, we're talking about kind of similar in hours, but it definitely would not be delivered in multiple days in a row of Zoom time, because it would be too exhausting for everybody. But it would give us an opportunity to work real specifically tailored to the local project's needs, and help think about different strategies and resources and approaches that can strengthen or enhance existing work, or even lay out some plans for starting some new work to enhance the response to our urban Native victims. And that would include working with existing Native programs that may be thinking about developing a domestic violence or sexual violence response, or may already have one in place, but it could be helpful to provide some additional support in their work. And then also what's important for us to think about is our non-Native relatives that are working with larger populations of Native victims, to be able to make sure that we can work with them to provide the kinds of support and information that might be helpful for them to strengthen the way that they work with our Native victims. The other piece that I want to talk about is hosting our RUN-TTA project training sessions and events. So with that, when we see that there are trainings where there might be places that urban programs might be going for their training needs, that we would work with whoever is putting that on to see if we can get in there to provide some sessions, either in breakout sessions or a pre-event piece at their conference or training. And so, such as an example, the sexual assault conference that happens on a regular basis, put on by CalCASA, that would be an ideal place where we would be able to reach urban populations, and then we could look at doing one breakout session or a couple breakout sessions, like a part 1, part 2, part 3 kind of thing, or even doing a half day to a full day training. Another example would be the Crimes Against Women conference that happens in Dallas. And actually we had planned this year to go there. And that would be another place that we would look at. And there's other options that we'll keep looking for and finding opportunities to provide those kind of trainings. And it would serve as helping us to engage in some outreach to urban programs that could benefit from this kind of TA, but also to, you know, meet the needs at the time as well. Next slide. Do you want to back up for just a second? We'll check and see if there's any questions. If you've got any questions, you can drop them in the chat or you can raise your hand. Oh, I don't know if we can see you if you raise your hand, but drop them in the chat and we can respond to that. And well, go ahead, Hanovi.
I'll be able to see if they raise their hand.
Okay, because I can't. While people are thinking if they have any questions, the other thing I want to say kind of generally is that our training and technical assistance is really about customized local work. So while we have some ideas and some ways that we've got in our minds in terms of starting this project out, that it's really driven by the need of the program and staff that are making the request. It's very customized, and so we can work in different kinds of settings and looking at different kinds of approaches. And so just a little bit more about myself, that I used to be the director of American Indian Community Housing in Duluth, Minnesota. And as a part of doing that work, so one, it was an urban native program. We were serving the surrounding tribes in our region, but also what we were surprised after we had developed our program was that we had expected that our primary population would be Anishinaabe from those surrounding tribes, but our primary populations tended to be from other tribes. It happened to be that we had a significant population of people from different tribes, even as far away as Alaska. And in that work, that we had many unique things that we had to address along the way. And one was helping our funders to understand that we were not a duplication of services. And as a part of that, educating not only the community at large about the needs of urban natives, but also the funding systems that were working with us so that they understood the critical importance of our work. And significantly in there, what we've learned over the years is that that when we talk about trauma-informed responses, that oftentimes trauma is about thinking about this current event and how that trauma carries afterwards. But our urban native populations tend to have a larger experience with trauma that comes from multi-generational trauma and historical trauma that they carry. So we need to be thinking about our responses of working with this current trauma and the way other traumas are so closely intertwined with our native populations. The other thing that people really like to know is that because we are grant funded through our OVW, training and technical assistance, that our grants cover our time and our work to provide the training and technical assistance. So it basically is free of cost. So it's not that we would approach a program and say, here, we want to do this work with you and can you pay us? We want to approach a program and say, here, we want to do this work with you and we will pay for ourselves to do that because we are grant funded and supported by the Office on Violence Against Women. So seeing that there are no questions, so let's move on to the next slide. So I want to share a quote that I really like. And to me, when I think about when I think about this work, this quote means a lot to it. And I'll just read it here to you. No right is more sacred to a nation, to a people, than the right to freely determine its social, economic, political, and cultural future without external interference. The fullest expression of this right occurs when a nation freely governs itself. And why I think that is so important is that, connecting back to what I said about having to address the fact that a Native specific response is not a duplication of efforts is that as Indigenous people, it's important for our non-Native relatives to recognize that we are not a homogeneous group. We are comprised of 574 federally recognized tribes, plus an additional other 400 tribes that don't have that same federal recognition. You know, these numbers fluctuate over time depending on what's happening. But in that, we are unique and different within our different tribal identities. And in our urban centers, we will find, as Hope mentioned earlier about the migration of people that came into the urban centers back in the 1950s, that often the urban centers will have between 50 to 100 or more distinct different tribal identities residing in that area. And as a part of, from our tribal perspective, that it's critical for us to develop and create responses that meet our needs. And that comes from recognizing that our cultural practices are the strongest tools, the strongest resources that we have for healing from violence. I mentioned previously about trauma and the impact on trauma, and that when we think about working around domestic violence, sexual violence, and the other crimes, such as stalking, dating violence, and sex trafficking, that we're talking about trauma, that trauma comes from those experiences with that violence, having been subjected to that violence. And we're working with a population that also walks and carries multi-generational and historical trauma. So we want to make sure that the responses are appropriate for the populations, the Native populations that are in the area. And that means that as a part of, for non-Natives doing this work, that it means that our non-Native relatives have some unique work to do on their own to strengthen their ability to be effective in working with our non-Native relatives or working with our urban Native populations, which can be challenging at times. I know that over the years I've worked with different non-Native populations, and it requires some understanding about some of the different ways that tribes are structured, some of the cultural differences, understanding the way trauma plays out, knowing the local cultural resources, and in that, recognizing the histories that took place and transpired on the local lands or in the local regions. And through that, trust is another critical aspect that needs to be developed. And that trust building doesn't happen overnight. Trust building is a process that is a part of undoing the impacts of the historical oppression that transpired. And so in doing that, it's a process of change and of building the relationship that happens over time. And just to connect back to this TA work that we do, that through Redwind and our work through the Responses for Urban Native Programs TA, we can work with our non-Native relatives to think about and figure out some strategies for trust building, for learning about the local histories and what that current day impact is in the work that you're working on addressing. And then critically, as I go back and revisit that quote, thinking about that as no right is more sacred, to freely determine our social, economic, and political and cultural futures, that then we want to work with our non-Native relatives, and it puts some responsibility back on our non-Native relatives to educate yourselves about what that means and develop an understanding of tribal sovereignty. And in our work as Indigenous peoples, that we think about our work in our violence against women work or anti-violence against women work as looking at and recognizing our Native survivors as sovereign beings, And so Red Wind can support and work with our non-Native relatives in creating a place to explore and discuss and learn about how to talk about and engage, and to find the resources that will support you on the local level, and develop strategies that can be enhanced, be stronger in the responses for our urban Native survivors. And I do see that Leanna has asked if we can share the quote or provide a link to it. What we can do is when we get to a point when I'm not talking, I can type it into the chat box. And if that doesn't work out for an opportunity, then we can make sure it gets sent out to everybody that's on this webinar today. So I think that there's a lot of work that we ask of our non-Native relatives. And I do want to say that we frame this in a way that recognizes that we are all in this together. It's not us and them kind of thing, that we think of those that are not Native as our relatives as well. And that while we're working to address domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, dating violence, and sex trafficking, that we all work together as relatives. And at different times, we have different challenges in this journey. So I do hope that our non-Native programs can see and recognize us as a resource to reach out, to provide some training and technical assistance, either to you yourself or to your staff and program. Hanovi, next slide. We also want to talk a little bit about self-care. And I actually was on a conversation the other day talking to somebody about self-care, and we talk about how we teach survivors how to do self-care work. And when we think about, and that's part of that healing from the violence work, but we also have to think about self-care and community care in a bigger and broader way. And so when I think about that, is that it's one of the critical aspects of this work that helps to ensure that we can continue to do this work and to grow this work. Because I've been doing this work for 35 years, and way back when, we weren't coming back and talking about self-care at that time, and we lost a lot of really valuable people that had a lot to offer everybody. And it happened because people got exhausted and somewhat burnt out from doing some really hard work. And so when we think about it, that it really is something that requires us to sustain ourselves and as we're dealing with these hard topics, and recognize that it adversely affects us. And so I think about it from the standpoint of resiliency, and that when we think about resiliency, it is about when something is resilient, that it has flexibility and an ability to bounce back or return back to an original shape or way of being. And so resiliency is what we want to build as a part of self-care, that we want to have the ability to strengthen our ability to bounce back from hearing these hard stories, and that we have the tools and resources within our organizations to create an environment that the trauma work that we're doing with survivors doesn't carry back into our staff and re-traumatize each other, or come back in a way that we're so traumatized that we're no longer effective in working with people that are in need of working with us. So our self-care and community care work comes from this place, and this is something that I was always taught, that we start, if we want to create change, we start with ourselves. And as we get more solid in that work, then we step it out to the next circle. And that becomes where we move from ourselves. The next circle tends to be our family, our immediate family. And then we move that out another step around our social circle, and then another step that might go out into a bigger circle of community, and then another circle around there for our society. And there's multiple other circles between that, which workplace plays out in those circles. So for me, when I think about work, I spend a lot of time in my work environment. And so they would be like after my family. And so we want to do that resiliency work, that healing work, that recovering from trauma work, so that we can be sustaining ourselves. And then as a part of that, we create an environment. So like I can do all the individual work I want. And if my workplace does not support me in that, then that's where it ends. I may end up losing some of that, the effectiveness of that work I do individually, if I don't have an environment that supports that. And then that carries out to not only the way our coworkers recognize that kind of work, but our institutional structures that we've created, such as policies and protocols that encourage us, and even things that allow us to take time off and have flexibility and stuff like that. So we really want to think about how we create that environment. And I do want to connect back to talking about trauma, because all of our work is rooted in the impacts of trauma, and that we're working at undoing and minimizing the negative impacts and healing from that. And that what we know from trauma is that trauma, unaddressed trauma, actually can have a significant impact on individuals that carries across a genetic change. So one individual not having that addressed and having it carry across multiple generations starts to end up imprinting in our genetic system, in our DNA, so that it really has a lasting negative impact. So we look at our native populations and we have high rates of diabetes, high rates of high blood pressure, high rates of cardiovascular disease, and all sorts of other illnesses that play out. That's the impact that's playing out from trauma, from unaddressed trauma. And then as we carry that into thinking about working in this field, then we can even see that carrying more forward. So as I think about self-care, community care, organizational care, individual advocate care, all of that, that one of the things Red Wind can do through our Urban Native TA is work with a program in figuring out some strategies on creating that environment that encourages support, nurturing, building resiliency, healing, and recovery. So can we have the next slide? So let's open it up to have any questions or comments. So again, Hanovi can see if you raise your hand, and you can also post it in the chat. Hope, do you have anything you'd like to add based on anything of what I've said while we wait to see if anybody's got any questions?
I'd just like to throw an example out there as far as how we can be specific to each program's needs. We're working with one program right now, and we really took 2 to 3 different Zoom meetings with the staff, the director, any other staff that would join. And we've created to fit their needs, a two-part webinar series that we're going to present for them and their whole staff. We just basically want to fill in any gaps that their program has, and again, make it specific to their program. So everybody's will be different. I do know we're going to do a protocol review in the middle between the 2 webinars, so that will help them as well. Just an example.
Yeah, thanks, Hope. And then we're also doing like a refresher after there's a little bit of space after that. And then We're also looking at working with their non-native partners. So great. Thanks for sharing that example.
While we're waiting for any questions, do you want to put the link to the quote?
Yes. Well, I don't have a link. I just have the quote.
And while we're waiting as well, I guess I could, if you go to red-wind.net and you go under programs, the OVW, I can't talk, OVW Tribal TTA, there will be the Urban Native programs. On that webpage, it'll have more information on how to contact myself or get the resources. I do have the fact sheets and the brochure right on that link as well.
Alrighty, well, I am not seeing any questions or hands being raised.
And so that is put in the chat now. So Leanna says, we always try to be very clear that we support the survivor's right to make their own decisions regarding any services we offer or options we discuss. How can we be clearer about recognizing the survivor's sovereignty? Well, and I think that one of the things for me when I think about a survivor's sovereignty is that oftentimes living with abuse that survivors lose that ability to make decisions. So one of the things that we've done over the years working with survivors is we educate them about what it means to have individual sovereignty. And that for her as an Indigenous woman, that it's important for her to understand her sovereignty. So there's an education piece that we do. And then as a part of it, so what you were saying, Leanne, about, that you're really clear about supporting their right to make their own decisions, about services that are offered and options that are available to them. That, so I think about that around victim autonomy. So sovereignty fits real close with victim autonomy. But the other part in there that when we think about a survivor at that, an Indigenous person having their own sovereignty, we connect it back to the similarities of tribal sovereignty. That as a tribe, they have, a tribe has its land base. And in that they have the right, so as I talk about self-determination, they have the right to make the decisions and manage their land. And so with that, then we make the parallel discussion and connection to that as a survivor, they have a right to make the decisions about their body and what happens to their body and what they want done to their body. And so we draw these different parallels, and we actually have a resource that has a chart that shows tribal sovereignty and individual sovereignty. And we can share that out afterwards. I don't have it at my fingertips to drop it in the chat, but we can share that. And so those kinds of conversations. So when we think about working with Native survivors, one of the things that is important is, and as a part of thinking about what's going to build resiliency from that negative impact of trauma and to minimize that negative impact and create healing, is that strengthening an Indigenous person's connection to their tribal identity is an important part of that healing process. So helping that survivor connect to understanding and bringing that to the front of their minds about their individual sovereignty will help to promote their healing and strengthen their identity as well. Are there any other questions and comments? So let's move to the last slide, Hanovi. So this has our contact information on here. And Hope is the project coordinator. So it's great if you remember her email, hope@red-win.net. So then you can reach out directly to her. If you forget that, you can reach out to info@red-win.net. And then the third option is to reach out to our website. And on our website, we do have a contact place there where people can go and find our contact information, and it has info@redwin.net on there. And the other thing it does is it has a button on that same page for people to make a request for training and or technical assistance. And sometimes what we find is people are like, okay, I want some technical assistance, but I don't know what it is. So what I just want to say is that that's okay. If you don't know what kind of training or technical assistance you want, you can just make a request and say that you'd like to talk about our training and technical assistance. And that would give us an opportunity to schedule a time to do a Zoom call and you to be able to bring in whoever else you think would be helpful to hear that and be a part of the conversation. And then from there, then we can figure out what might be helpful for you. And then it's not like we say, okay, here's the only thing we can offer. We basically say, here's some of our ideas, give people an opportunity to react to it. And it actually helps to grow the ideas beyond that initial putting things out there. Hope?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for joining today and then invite you all to like our Red Wind Facebook page as well, as we're hopefully going to be starting to put some more information on that. And feel free to contact me, via email with any questions or feedback about the webinar. We'd appreciate it. And thank you guys.
Thank you.
All righty. Does anyone have any final questions or any comments before we close up?
I did want to add one more thing. I do believe the webinar should be, you can access that on our website within 1 to 2 days.
Yes, and the webinar is recorded, so it will be up on the Red Wind Facebook page, or not Facebook, YouTube channel as well. And that will be up with either today or tomorrow, depending on how long it takes to process. And I'm not seeing any questions, so we will start wrapping up. Before we end the session, I want to inform everyone that you'll be getting a survey pop up after the webinar ends, as well as over email by tomorrow. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it, because it helps us improve our webinars. I would like to thank our presenters for being here today. I would like to thank our captioner, And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar.